The laughter and clinking glasses of the Kingsley Hotel ballroom seemed to swell and blur as Mark Harrison stood frozen near the buffet table. Across the room, under the warm glow of the chandeliers, his wife, Jenna, was dancing with her boss, Greg Wilson. It wasn't the dancing that bothered him, not at first. Jenna was sociable, always charming at events like this. But something about her body language stopped Mark cold. The way she leaned into Greg's chest as if there wasn't a single other person in the room. The way his hand, meant for her waist, slid just slightly lower. The way Jenna laughed, a tinkling, melodic laugh he hadn't heard in months. The air in the room suddenly felt too thick, the scent of champagne and perfume cloying. Mark put down his untouched glass of wine and adjusted his tie, a nervous habit. His gaze stayed fixed on the pair, unwilling to believe what his gut was screaming. This wasn't nothing. This was something. Mark. Hey, buddy. A coworker's jovial slap on his shoulder startled him, but Mark barely glanced in his direction. Not now, Mark muttered, his tone sharper than he intended. The coworker gave a confused shrug and walked off, but Mark was already moving, gravitating toward the dance floor as if pulled by an invisible force. He kept a measured pace, each step deliberate, the din of the party around him fading into static. Jenna's back was to him now, her arm draped over Greg's shoulder. Greg's hand slid down, gripping her hip, and then he leaned in, whispering something that made Jenna smile in a way that sent a jolt of fury through Mark. The fury wasn't for Greg, not yet. It was for the gnawing, sickening fear that this wasn't innocent. Hey! Mark's voice cut through the music as he stepped onto the edge of the dance floor. Jenna stiffened, her eyes widening as she turned to see him. Greg pulled back, his trademark shark-like grin instantly replaced with a mask of faux innocence. Mark, Jenna said, her tone an attempt at breezy nonchalance. I didn't see you there. Mark didn't let her finish. His glare locked onto Greg. You've got a lot of nerve, pal. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Greg raised his hands in mock surrender. Whoa, whoa. Relax, big guy. It's just a dance. Mark wasn't buying it. That's not what it looked like. His voice dropped, low and venomous. Before Greg could reply, Jenna stepped between them, her face pale. Mark, stop it. You're embarrassing yourself. Embarrassing himself? The words hit him like a slap, but the fire in his chest only burned hotter. Why don't we step outside? Greg suggested, his tone condescending as he gestured toward the balcony. For a split second, Mark considered taking the bait and decking him right there, but Jenna's trembling hand on his arm made him hesitate. She wasn't pleading for Greg, she was pleading for herself. Against his better judgment, Mark followed them to the balcony. Cool night air replaced the suffocating warmth of the ballroom, but it did little to calm him. What the hell's going on here? Mark demanded, his voice tight. Mark, Jenna started, but Greg interrupted. Nothing's going on, Mark. Seriously. It's a work party. We're celebrating. Mark's fist clenched, and for a moment, he saw Greg's smug face meeting his knuckles. But then Greg leaned closer, his voice dropping just enough to force Jenna to strain to hear. Or do you want to talk about her little extracurricular activities instead? Jenna's eyes went wide. Greg, stop, she hissed, but the damage was done. What did you just say? Mark asked, his voice dangerously low. Greg smirked, brushing an invisible speck of lint from his sleeve. Nothing. Forget it. I've said enough. Mark had heard enough too. Without thinking, he shoved Greg back, hard enough to send the man stumbling into the balcony railing. Jenna gasped, stepping between them again. Mark. Stop it, she shouted, her voice trembling. But it was her face that betrayed her, a flash of panic that wasn't directed at Greg. It was directed at Mark. And in that moment, the first crack in Mark's world turned into a gaping chasm. The man he shoved wasn't just an arrogant boss with boundary issues. The woman pulling him away wasn't just his wife caught in an awkward situation. This was something else. Something far worse. And he was going to find out exactly what. The drive home from the Kingsley Hotel was tense, silent. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Beside him, Jenna sat rigid, her gaze fixed out the passenger side window, her crimson gown now crumpled and wrinkled, a stark contrast to the polished facade she wore earlier in the evening. "Say something," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't trust himself to speak yet. His mind replayed Greg's parting words over and over. Extracurricular activities. What did he mean? The doubt gnawed at him like a parasite, turning every memory of Jenna's late nights, her distant glances, and her endless work commitments into something sinister. "Mark," Jenna tried again, louder this time. It wasn't what it looked like. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Really? Because it looked like my wife was cozying up to her boss while he had his hands all over her." "It was nothing," she insisted, her voice rising. "Greg was being. Greg. You know how he is. He's like that with everyone." Mark pulled into their driveway and killed the engine, the car falling into an eerie silence. He finally turned to face her, his eyes cold. "Then what did he mean back there, Jenna? About extracurricular activities?" Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her hesitation was all the confirmation he needed. Mark exhaled slowly, trying to rein in the storm building inside him. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What?" Jenna blinked, confusion flashing across her face. "How long have you been sleeping with him?" Her eyes widened. "Mark, I didn't. Don't lie to me." His voice thundered in the small space of the car, and Jenna flinched. "Don't you dare lie to me, Jenna. I saw the way you looked at him tonight. I'm not an idiot." Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, Mark thought she might deny everything, swear on their marriage, plead for his trust. But what she said next shattered whatever fragile hope he had left. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her voice cracking. Mark laughed bitterly, slamming his palm against the steering wheel. "Oh, that's rich. The classic line. It's not what I think. What a relief. Because I thought you were screwing your boss behind my back." "I'm not." Jenna insisted, her tears spilling over. "I swear, I'm not." But what?" His voice was sharp, biting. Jenna looked away, her face crumpling. "It's complicated." Mark let out a hollow laugh, leaning back in his seat. "Complicated? Sure. That's one word for it. You know what's not complicated, Jenna? The truth. So why don't you try that for a change?" She didn't answer, and the silence that followed was deafening. Mark felt like he was drowning in it, each second stretching into eternity. "Get out," he said finally, his voice flat. "Mark. Out." Jenna hesitated, then opened the door and stepped out onto the driveway. Mark stayed in the car for a moment, watching her through the windshield. She looked small, fragile, her shoulders hunched as she stood in the cold night air. He couldn't bring himself to follow her inside. Not yet. Instead, Mark pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the contact list. His thumb hovered over a name, Chris. His best friend since college, the one person who'd always had his back, no matter what. The phone rang twice before Chris picked up, his voice groggy. "Mark? Dude, it's almost midnight. What's up?" "I think Jenna's cheating on me," Mark said, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Shit," Chris finally said. "You sure?" Mark ran a hand through his hair, staring out the windshield at the darkened street. No. Yes. I don't know. But something's not right. Chris sighed. Okay. You want me to come over? Mark hesitated. No. Not yet. I just needed to say it out loud. Well, if you change your mind, you know where to find me, Chris said. And Mark? Whatever's going on, you're not crazy. Trust your gut. Mark hung up without replying, his chest tight. When he finally stepped inside the house, Jenna was sitting on the edge of their bed, her makeup streaked from tears. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of guilt and desperation. We need to talk, she said softly. Mark nodded, his jaw clenched. Yeah. We do. But in that moment, as he looked at the woman he'd loved for 7 years, he realized he wasn't sure he wanted to hear whatever she had to say. Because no matter how complicated the truth was, it wouldn't make the betrayal hurt any less. Mark didn't sleep that night. He sat in the living room, nursing a drink he didn't want and staring at the blank TV screen. Upstairs, Jenna was likely lying awake too, the tension in the house thick enough to choke on. Her earlier words played on a loop in his head, it's complicated. What could possibly be complicated about staying faithful? About respecting the life they had built together? He tried to ignore the nagging voice whispering in his mind, the one urging him to dig deeper. Part of him still clung to the hope that Jenna wasn't lying, that Greg's insinuations were nothing more than a cruel joke. But another part, the one gnawing at his gut, demanded answers. By the time the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, Mark had made up his mind. He wasn't going to wait for Jenna's half-baked explanations. He needed the truth, and he needed it now. Jenna was in the kitchen when Mark walked in, still in her rumpled gown from the night before. She looked up from her untouched cup of coffee, her expression weary and defensive. Did you sleep? She asked softly. Mark ignored the question, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. I want the whole story, Jenna. Now. No lies. No, it's complicated. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. Mark, it's not. Save it, he cut her off, his voice like ice. You've been acting strange for months. Late nights, avoiding my questions, and last night. Last night wasn't just Greg being Greg. Jenna looked down, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her coffee mug. I didn't want it to come out like this, she murmured. Then how did you want it to come out? Mark asked, his tone sharp. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Or were you hoping Greg would keep his mouth shut? Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. Greg doesn't know anything. He's just a what? Mark's voice rose. A harmless flirt? A touchy-feely boss? Give me a break, Jenna. He knows something, and you're going to tell me what? Jenna stood abruptly, pacing the kitchen. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she said, her voice shaking. It started with the project. You know how much pressure I was under. Greg was supportive, and Mark's stomach turned. And what? And I let things get blurred, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The room spun for a moment as Mark tried to process her words. Blurred, he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. What does that mean? Did you sleep with him? No. Jenna's voice cracked, and she turned to face him, her eyes brimming with tears. I swear, I didn't. But, there were moments. Moments I shouldn't have let happen. Mark stared at her, the weight of her confession pressing down on his chest. Like what? Jenna hesitated, and Mark slammed his fist on the table, making her jump. Like what, Jenna? Like kisses, she said finally, her voice breaking. And touching. But it never went further than that. I swear, Mark. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. It was worse than he thought. The woman he'd loved for years had betrayed him, not in the physical sense, perhaps, but in every other way that mattered. "You should have told me," he said after a long silence. "I wanted to," she said, sitting down across from him again. "But I was scared. I knew I'd screwed up, and I didn't want to lose you." Mark laughed bitterly. "And yet here we are." "Mark, I'm so sorry," Jenna said, reaching for his hand. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. I'll quit my job, I'll cut Greg out of my life, anything you want." He pulled his hand away, the anger simmering just beneath his skin. "It's not that simple, Jenna. You didn't just cheat on me. You lied to me. 4 months. How am I supposed to trust you after this?" Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands, sobbing. Mark watched her for a moment, his heart torn between rage and the deep ache of betrayal. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that they could fix what was broken. But every time he thought of Greg's hands on her, of the laughter they'd shared last night, it felt like a knife twisting in his chest. "I need time," he said finally, his voice cold. Jenna looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with desperation. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm leaving for a while," he said, standing. "You can stay here. Figure out what you want. But don't call me. Don't text me. I'll come back when I'm ready." "Mark, please." "I said don't," he snapped, and she flinched. Without another word, Mark grabbed his keys and walked out the door, the weight of the broken trust hanging over him like a storm cloud. As he drove away, one thought echoed in his mind: what other truths had she been hiding? Mark checked into a motel on the outskirts of town, tossing his bag onto the bed and collapsing into the single chair in the corner. The room smelled faintly of stale air and disinfectant, but he didn't care. He needed space, physical and mental, to sort through the chaos Jenna had dumped into his life. The idea of her and Greg, of them, played on an endless loop in his mind. Her words echoed like a cruel taunt, its complicated, blurred lines. Mark wanted to believe her when she swore it hadn't gone further, but the gnawing doubt in his gut refused to settle. He reached for his phone, hesitating before scrolling through his contacts. Who could he call? Chris was supportive, but he'd already been Mark's lifeline once tonight. He couldn't call his family, they'd only ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. And then he saw the name, Nathan Paul. Nathan was Jenna's co-worker, someone Mark had met a handful of times at their corporate events. He wasn't particularly close to Nathan, but the guy had always seemed honest, unlike Greg, who reeked of sleaze. If anyone knew what was really going on at the office, it might be Nathan. Before he could second-guess himself, Mark hit the call button. "Mark?" Nathan's voice came through, confused. "Hey, what's up? Everything okay?" Mark's throat felt tight, but he forced himself to speak. "Nathan, I need to ask you something. It's about Jenna. And Greg." There was a long pause on the other end. When Nathan finally spoke, his tone was cautious. Okay. What about them?" Mark gripped the phone tighter. "Do you know if there's anything going on between them? And don't sugarcoat it. I need the truth." Nathan hesitated, and Mark could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "Look," Nathan said finally, his voice low. "I've heard things. Nothing concrete, but Greg's not exactly subtle. People talk. You know how it is." "What kind of things?" Mark pressed. Nathan sighed. "Like him favoring her for projects. Long meetings behind closed doors. Stuff like that. Honestly, I thought it was just Greg being a creep. But if you're asking me this, maybe there's more to it." Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't need to hear more. He thanked Nathan and ended the call, his stomach churning with a mix of anger and dread. If Jenna wasn't lying, if nothing physical had happened, why did everyone at the office have their suspicions? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Mark drove back to their neighborhood under the cover of darkness. He parked down the street from his own house, watching the glow of lights in the upstairs window. Jenna was home, but she wasn't what he was there for. Quietly, he entered through the back door. The familiarity of the house felt strange now, like it wasn't his anymore. Moving carefully, he made his way to Jenna's office. Mark flipped on the desk lamp and opened her laptop, praying she hadn't changed her password. The familiar login screen greeted him, and he exhaled with relief when her old password worked. Her emails were a mess of work correspondences, project updates, and client meetings. Nothing immediately suspicious. He scanned through them, skimming over Greg's name until he found an exchange that made his blood run cold. From Greg Wilson. Subject, last night. Jenna. I know you're worried about Mark, but last night was worth the risk. Seeing you like that, let's just say it's hard to stay professional around you. Can we meet again tomorrow? Same place. Gee. Mark sat back in the chair, his heart pounding in his chest. Last night? What the hell did that mean? And what place were they meeting? He clicked on her calendar, scrolling through her recent entries. A notation for a client meeting at a downtown restaurant the previous evening caught his eye. That must be it, he thought grimly. But why wasn't it enough to confront her with this? Why did he feel the need to see it for himself? The next morning, Mark was parked outside the restaurant listed in Jenna's calendar. He sat in his car, sipping coffee and waiting for some kind of confirmation. Hours passed. He wondered if he was losing his mind, letting paranoia consume him. But then, just as the lunch rush began, Greg stepped out of a sleek black car and walked toward the restaurant. Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Minutes later, Jenna arrived, wearing the same black coat she always wore to work meetings. She greeted Greg at the entrance, her smile hesitant but warm. The knot in Mark's stomach tightened. They sat at a table by the window, their expressions serious as they talked. To an outsider, it might have looked like a business meeting. But Mark knew better. He could see the small gestures, the subtle lean toward one another, the unspoken tension between them. It wasn't innocent. Mark didn't wait to see more. He drove away, his heart pounding, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. If Jenna had told him the whole truth, why was she meeting Greg like this? And what the hell was Mark supposed to do now? Mark sat in his car outside the motel, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The afternoon sun burned down, but he barely noticed. He was numb, replaying what he'd seen over and over, Jenna and Greg in that restaurant, their heads bent close together like co-conspirators. The kind of intimacy he once thought belonged only to him. He'd followed Jenna and Greg from the restaurant after their meeting ended. They hadn't gone back to the office. Instead, Greg had driven to a seedy motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that charged by the hour and didn't bother with questions. When Jenna's car pulled in beside Greg's, Mark felt the world tilt. For a second, he thought he might black out. He watched as Jenna got out of her car, clutching her purse tightly, and followed Greg inside without hesitation. He couldn't remember driving to the parking lot across the street or parking his car. All he knew was that he was here now, staring at the neon sign blinking vacancy, and his wife was in there with her boss. This is it, he thought. This is where the lies end. Mark pushed open the door to the motel lobby, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. The clerk behind the counter barely glanced up from his phone, mumbling a distracted, "Can I help you?" "Room number for Greg Wilson," Mark demanded, his voice cold and sharp. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "We don't give out room numbers. Privacy policy." Mark slammed both hands onto the counter, leaning in close. "You see that car out front? The black BMW? That's his. And if you don't tell me his room number, I'm calling the cops and telling them this place is running an escort ring. Want to see how fast this whole operation gets shut down? The clerk blinked, his face pale. Room 214, he muttered. Mark didn't wait for more. He strode toward the staircase, each step feeling like an eternity. His fists clenched and unclenched, his mind racing with every worst-case scenario. He stopped in front of room 214, staring at the door as if it were a monster he had to slay. Voices carried faintly through the thin walls, Greg's deep and smug, Jenna's softer and almost pleading. Mark raised his hand to knock but stopped. No. This wasn't going to be polite. He wasn't here to ask questions. With one swift motion, he twisted the doorknob and shoved the door open. The room was cheap, ugly floral bedspread, dim lighting, the faint smell of cleaning products mixed with something sour. And there they were. Greg stood by the bed, his suit jacket off, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. Jenna was perched on the edge of the bed, her coat still on, her expression frozen in shock as she turned to face Mark. Mark, she stammered, standing so quickly she nearly tripped. What are you? Don't, Mark snapped, his voice shaking with fury. Don't you dare act surprised. Greg smirked, unfazed by the intrusion. I'm guessing this is your husband, Jenna. Shut up, Mark snarled, taking a step toward him. Mark, please, Jenna said, her voice desperate. It's not what it looks like. Stop lying. Mark shouted, his voice echoing in the small room. I followed you here. I saw you meet him at the restaurant. And now you're in a motel room with him. So don't even try to tell me this is innocent. Jenna's face crumpled, and for a moment, Mark thought she might deny it. But instead, she broke down, tears spilling over as she sank back onto the bed. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she sobbed. Mark turned to Greg, his anger boiling over. And you? You think you can just screw around with another man's wife and walk away? Greg raised his hands in mock surrender. Hey, man, calm down. It's not like. Mark didn't let him finish. He lunged forward, grabbing Greg by the collar and shoving him against the wall. You don't get to talk, Mark growled, his face inches from Greg's. You don't get to smirk. You don't get to exist in my life anymore. Greg struggled, his expression shifting from smug to nervous. Take it easy, man. Jenna came to me. Not the other way around. Mark froze, his grip loosening slightly. He turned to look at Jenna, who was staring at the floor, her shoulders shaking. Is that true? He asked, his voice low. Jenna didn't answer. Is it true? Mark demanded, his voice cracking. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. Mark, I was lonely. You were always working, always distant. And Greg, he was there. The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He stepped back, releasing Greg, who slumped against the wall. You disgust me, Mark said, his voice trembling. He turned to Jenna, his eyes cold. Both of you. He walked out without another word, leaving Jenna sobbing on the bed and Greg glaring after him. As he stepped into the fresh air, Mark felt like his world had shattered. The truth was out now, but it didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. And it left one question burning in his mind: what the hell do I do now? Mark didn't go back to the motel that night. He drove aimlessly, his thoughts churning in a storm of rage, heartbreak, and disbelief. The betrayal cut deeper than he imagined it could. The woman he had vowed to love and trust had looked him in the eyes and chosen someone else, someone she worked with, someone she p. Finally, he pulled into the parking lot of a late-night diner, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. The bright fluorescent lights inside felt almost mocking, a harsh contrast to the. Sliding into a booth, Mark stared at the laminated menu without seeing it. A waitress approached, her voice chipper but tired. "Coffee?" "Yeah," Mark muttered, barely glancing at he. She poured him a cup and left him alone, and for that, he was grateful. The silence gave him room to think. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. He hesitated. It rang twice before Chris picked up, his voice gr. "No," Mark admitted, his voice hoarse. "I'm not okay." "What happened?" Chris asked. Mark's grip on the phone tightened. "She lied to me. About everything. I caught her meeting Greg AG." Chris let out a low whistle. "Damn, man. I'm so sorry." "What did she say?" Mark's laugh was bitter. "That she was lonely. That it was my fault. Can you believe that? She screwed around, and somehow, it's my fault." "People like that always find a way to shift the blame," Chris said. "She's just trying to justify her choices. Don't let her manipulate you." "I'm not," Mark said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. I don't know what to do next. Do I leave? Do I fight for her? Can you even fix something this broken?" Chris sighed. "You already know the answer to that, Mark. The real question is, do you think you can ever trust her again?" Mark closed his eyes, the truth stabbing at him like a blade. "I don't think I can." "Then you've got your answer," Chris said gently. "You don't owe her anything, Mark. She made her choice. Now you need to make yours." The next morning, Mark returned to the house. He wasn't ready to talk to Jenna, but he needed to figure out his next steps. The house felt different now, like a stranger's home. Jenna was sitting at the kitchen table when he walked in, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked up, her expression a mix of hope and despair. "Mark," she started, her voice trembling. He held up a hand, stopping her. "Don't. I don't want to hear it." "But." "I said don't." His tone was ice. He sat across from her, his eyes locked on hers. "I've spent the whole night thinking about this. About us. And I realized something. You didn't just betray me, Jenna. You destroyed the foundation of our marriage. Trust, respect, honesty, all of it, gone." She broke into fresh tears, her hands covering her face. "I'm sorry. I know I hurt you, but I swear I can fix this. I'll quit my job. I'll never see Greg again. Please, Mark, don't throw us away." Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You think this is about Greg? This isn't just about him, Jenna. This is about you. About the choices you made. The lies you told. I can't unsee what I saw. I can't unhear what you said. And I don't think I can forgive you." Her sobs grew louder, but Mark felt no sympathy. If anything, he felt a grim satisfaction in finally saying the words that had been burning inside him. "I'm filing for divorce," he said, his tone flat. Jenna froze, her breath hitching. "Mark, no. Please don't do this. We can go to counseling. We can." "It's too late for that," he interrupted. "You killed this marriage, Jenna. Not me. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." Her face crumpled, and she reached across the table for his hand, but he pulled away. "Mark, I love you. I do. I just—" "Stop," he said sharply. "You don't get to say that. Not anymore." He stood, grabbing his keys from the counter. "I'll come back for my things later. Don't be here when I do. Mark, please." But he was already walking out the door, her desperate cries echoing behind him. Mark drove for hours, the weight of his decision sinking in. It wasn't easy. Part of him still loved Jenna, still longed for the life they'd built together. But love wasn't enough, not after everything she'd done. Chris's words came back to him, "Do you think you can ever trust her again?" And now, as he stared at the horizon, Mark knew the answer. No. He couldn't. Mark stood in the driveway of what had once been his home, staring at the house as if it were a stranger. The place felt haunted now, a repository of broken promises and shattered trust. The front porch light was on, a detail that made his chest tighten. Jenna had always insisted on leaving it lit for him whenever he worked late. But this wasn't his home anymore. It was a place he was leaving behind. The front door creaked open, and Jenna stepped out. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red from crying. She clutched a thin sweater around her shoulders, though the evening was warm. "I packed up your things," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Mark nodded. He wasn't sure what else to say. Jenna hesitated, then stepped aside, gesturing toward the boxes lined neatly in the living room. Mark entered without a word, the silence between them thick and heavy. As he started carrying boxes out to his car, she lingered in the doorway, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. When he came back for the last box, she finally spoke. "Mark, I know I don't deserve anything from you, but, please. Can we talk? One last time?" He paused, the box heavy in his arms. For a moment, he considered refusing. What good could come from more words? But something in her voice, a desperate fragility, made him relent. He set the box down and nodded. "Fine," he said, his voice flat. "Say what you need to say." She wrung her hands, her eyes darting between him and the floor. I want you to know how sorry I am. I know I destroyed everything. And I don't expect you to forgive me, but I loved you, Mark. I still do. I never wanted this to happen." Mark's jaw tightened, and he folded his arms. "Then why did it?" Her lips trembled. "I don't know. I was stupid. Lonely. I felt like I was losing you, and Greg, he made me feel." "Don't," Mark interrupted, his voice hard. "Don't you dare try to justify this by blaming me. I wasn't perfect, Jenna, but I didn't cheat. I didn't lie. That was you." She flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know. And I hate myself for it. I've lost you, haven't I?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but he was too tired. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only sadness and resignation. "Yes," he said finally. "You've lost me." Her sobs grew louder, and she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Mark felt a pang of guilt, but he forced himself to push it aside. "You'll be okay, Jenna," he said, his tone softer now. "You're strong. You'll move on. But I can't be part of your life anymore." She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" Mark hesitated. Forgiveness felt like an impossible mountain to climb. But deep down, he didn't want to carry the weight of this anger forever. "Maybe," he said honestly. "But not today." He picked up the last box and walked out the door. The days that followed were both agonizing and liberating. Mark moved into a small apartment closer to his job, a modest space that felt strangely freeing. Without Jenna's presence, the air was lighter, but the silence was deafening. Chris came over one night with pizza and beer, insisting that Mark needed a distraction. They talked and laughed like old times, but when Chris left, the loneliness crept back in. It wasn't until a few weeks later that Mark truly started to feel like himself again. One evening, he found himself at a park near his apartment, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. As he sat on the bench, a woman jogged by, her golden retriever trotting happily beside her. She glanced at Mark and smiled, a small, genuine smile that took him by surprise. For the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled back. Months turned into a year. The divorce was finalized quietly, without much drama. Jenna left the company, a choice Mark respected. They didn't speak often, though she occasionally sent messages through mutual friends, asking how he was. Mark never replied. By then, he had started to move on. He joined a local hiking group, where he met new people and rediscovered parts of himself he'd lost in the chaos of his marriage. He even started dating again, cautiously at first. One day, while sorting through old belongings, Mark found a photo of him and Jenna on their wedding day. They looked so happy, so full of hope. He stared at it for a long moment before placing it in a box marked memories. It was time to let go. As he carried the box to the closet, Mark felt a strange sense of peace. His life wasn't perfect, but it was his again. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Because sometimes, letting go wasn't the end. It was the beginning.